the slide says, I am indeed going to be talking about standardized heat network business modeling. And I should probably start off with a confession. This is something of a passion for me. I have to say that I almost see it as a calling. I've been doing it for 6 or 7 years now, and it just keeps getting more interesting to me. But granted, there will be some members of the audience who finds the thought of looking at an Excel sheet with a business case for a district heating network about as pleasurable as getting your hand slammed into a car door. Bearing that in mind, I think it's worth mentioning that to me, business case modeling reminds me the most of Scottish single malt whiskey. Now, it does this for a number of reasons, but mainly it's because there's infinite variety. You can go from something which is very smooth, very mellow, and very satisfying to something which is incredibly complex and makes you think a lot. And unfortunately, in some instances, even with immeasurable time and resources put into it, what you get out the other end just isn't quite up to scratch. I'm going to speak only about 2 things today. Just briefly touching upon some of the latest work out of HMDU, and then I'm going to dig straight into common assumptions for inputs and outputs of Excel modeling, leaving the actual modeling bit as a black box for another time. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Heat Networks delivery unit. I did just want to mention, though, that they are doing a lot of work and putting on a lot of outputs out currently, which are helpful in standardizing the heat networks modeling for across the sector, regardless of whether you're using HMDU funding or not. If you are doing district heat modeling without HMDU funding, I would recommend you take a look at some of the material that they're providing. And they have authorized me to share one of their latest bits, which is this heat network project metric template, where they're trying to collect information to compare district heating networks across the UK, which is actually a very valid and also a very complicated endeavor, because district heat networks are, by their very nature, not easily comparable. There are only about 3 slides left. I'm not heavy with the slides usage. To start with, common assumptions. The key one, if you're building a district heat business model, is to know your business as usual case. And that will be either a do nothing or do minimum, or in some cases it will be both. And I've written ideally, but actually, as a minimum, you should have at least 3 years knowledge of the kind of heat consumption your customer base has. Now, in cases where you're doing new build, obviously that's not always a possibility, but there you should do some reality check on what other new builds are doing across the country and what kind of heat consumption they have, because some of the standard assumptions tend to overstate heat demand. Also, if you have identified anchor load customers in your heat network, I cannot stress this enough, start by talking to them before you build the business model, because there is absolutely nothing more depressing than going through all of that work and having a business case settled and then bringing it to your anchor load customers who have already decided to do something else in the meantime. Terrible situation to be in. Now, in terms of common assumptions that drive the business case, this slide is all about inputs. The last slide is all about outputs. And in terms of inputs, this will be basic knowledge to some of you in the audience, but it's worth touching upon anyway, because there are variations across different business models. I've looked at quite a few in my time, both here in the UK and in Scandinavia and Germany, and there are distinctions based on what kind of local characteristics you have. But basics are the value of heat, which you need the business as usual scenario to figure out, because heat doesn't have a price as such. It's usually based on where people are getting their heat from now. So it could be energy from waste, as Andrew was talking about. It could be individual gas boilers based on natural gas. It could be any combination of factors, and it's really important before you go any further that you know what your customers are already paying for heat. Otherwise, you cannot show them how much better, or in some cases worse off they would be if they switched to district heating. And it goes without saying that if you've got combined heat and power, you should also be checking the value of electricity. Is it private wire? Is it being used on site? What proportion is being exported to the grid? What prices? What contracts are in place? Fuel costs is an interesting one. If you're looking at natural gas, there's more question of where do you procure your natural gas? Who is procuring it? Do one of your anchor load customers, do they have a special procurement platform which gets them a better price than everybody else in the network? And if so, can you use it? That has been the case in some scenarios. More specifically, though, what you want the fuel cost contracts for is if you're thinking of putting in biomass boilers at some point. So it's nice if you get a long-term contract, like a 10 or 15-year contract for your biomass, and you make sure that you index it to moisture content of your biomass, or if it's available, a standardized form of output where the moisture content is already controlled for. I'm saying that because biomass specifically has the fuel content of it will vary quite significantly. If you're using straw, for example, that can be very entertaining to try and figure out what the energy content of what you're putting in actually is. System efficiency, there are actually 3 places where you lose system efficiency in a district heating network, broad terms. But the one I was thinking, one of them isn't really that relevant because it's at the building level, and that will be the same case with or without a district heating network, so it's a constant, you can ignore it, unless you're expecting substantial improvements in the building stock. However, of course, transformation losses and distribution losses are key, and if you're looking at transformation losses, and so this is at your energy center, so this is your energy input going into your combined heat and power or your boiler, and what's coming out at the other end. Are you getting steam? Are you getting high-grade heat? Are you getting low-grade heat? What combination of those are you getting? How does the efficiency change across the year? How many hours is it going to run? All of these are incredibly important to factor into a business model. Distribution losses, that of course refers mainly to the pipe work, so the quality of the pipe you're putting into ground, as well as the kind of heat that you're transporting around the pipe network. So if you're transporting steam, you will tend to lose slightly more heat, all else equal, because the temperature differential is greater. Low-grade heat, if you're transporting that around, so say at 50 degrees Celsius, there's a lower heat loss, but it comes with its own problems. Baseload heat demand is, of course, a key one, especially with seasonal variations. Now, you could be in a situation, if you're really lucky, where your customers have completely stable demand across the season. However, if you're considering putting residential units on board, that's incredibly unlikely. So it's key that you think into your model how these seasonal fluctuations are going to affect the business case. Do you charge a different price in the summer than you do in the winter to get people to use more heat in the summer? Do you entice baseload customers with high heat demand profiles in the summer in some way or form? Hotels are great in places where you have lots of tourists, by the way, because they use a lot of hot water during the summer. Lots of different consideration. Subsidies and taxes are obviously also a key driver, and I'm not going to touch more on that because I think that one should be pretty obvious. Financing costs, again, I think one of the other panel speakers will be speaking more about that. I put carbon emissions in brackets at the end. Now, I'm from the Carbon Trust, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to a low-carbon economy. Carbon emissions is kind of the key thing for us. In terms of modeling, though, it's great to have in because it gives you a reality check. Now, you're not going to put in district heating into an area if it's not the most efficient solution, or a more efficient solution than your business as usual case. And your carbon emissions is kind of what gives you a sense check of the rest of the calculations in your model. Because if you are not reducing carbon, either the area you want to put district heating in is incredibly unsuited for district heating, or there's something in the model which doesn't quite make sense. So it's a great reality check to have in the model, regardless, of course, you should also be fundamentally interested in reducing your carbon emissions, but from a purely modeling perspective, it's a great reality check to have in. How much time do I have left? Is that 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 5 minutes? My last slide is my favorite topic. So what's interesting to me from the DEC HNDU heat metric project template that I showed a snapshot of, they are now asking for 3 financial metrics in their outputs. They're asking for net present value, internal rate of return in various forms, and a return on investment. Now, they're not doing that to be difficult. They're doing that because there are issues with making judgment calls based solely on net present value or internal rate of return. For net present value, there are a lot of ways you can do this. I was going to say wrong, but that almost sounds conceited. But I mean, there are a lot of small mistakes you can make in calculating your net present value. And I've put one or two up on the board. So in terms of if you are using inflation, remember to amend your discount rate, because that doesn't always happen. And if you're including loan financing, sometimes people will put the interest rate straight onto the discount rate, but that will only work if you've calculated specifically for the lifetime of the investment, which sometimes tends to be longer than your loan. These have small and but sometimes very large, significant impacts on what looks like the project viability. Now, net present value is of course useful, and generally speaking, if your net present value is greater than 0, you should make the investment. Internal rate of return is something which is often used as a measure of profitability. And that is not entirely correct. In fact, it's a constant source of discussion in academia. There's a whole sample of literature now devoted to finding out why people are still using the internal rate of return, because it was disproved 30 or 40 years ago as a mathematical profitability measure. So when you're using the internal rate of return, basically what it tells you is the same thing as your net present value tells you. Yes, no, this is a good investment. So if your internal rate of return is higher than your discount rate or your hurdle rate or your cost of capital, whichever of those measures that you're using, then it's a profitable investment. It doesn't, however, tell you anything in terms of if you have a project with internal rate of return and another project which has a higher internal rate of return, that doesn't mean the project with a higher internal rate of return is more profitable. It looks like it, but it doesn't. Anyways, that's one of the reasons why I was really pleased to see that the HNDU project metric template now also requires you to put in your return on investment, because that does give you, that's one option, one alternative option of calculating profitability on your business model, which will give you a more realistic indicator of the actual project viability. So, how am I doing for time now? 1 minute, right. That went a bit faster. I wonder what I forgot to say that I was practicing on the train this morning. I'm just going to put up that final slide. But in conclusion, in terms of business model, in terms of moving towards a standardized business model, it's very important that the things that you put in and the things that you get out are comparable to, if not what the UK is doing as a whole, then at least the other projects that you are looking at across the board within your company or within your local authority. Otherwise, you lose the comparability aspect. And I have to say that sometimes some of the outputs that you see can be a bit frightening. So do please be a bit careful when you engage with business modeling.